The light in the living room had settled into that familiar evening glow, not bright and not quite dim, just enough to soften the corners of the room and take the edge off the day. The lamp beside the armchair cast a warm circle across the rug, and beyond it the rest of the room rested quietly, as though it knew there was no need to hurry. The television was on, its picture steady and unassuming, filling the space with a gentle presence rather than demanding attention. The Andy Griffith Show was playing, though no one in the room was sitting forward or watching closely. The voices drifted easily through the air, familiar and even-tempered, rising and falling without urgency. There was a calm to the sound of it, a rhythm that had been shaped long ago and never seemed to wear thin. The black and white picture glowed softly, Mayberry appearing as it always did, untroubled and unhurried. In the kitchen, just off the living room, the sink had been cleared and wiped down, the faint scent of dish soap still lingering. A towel hung neatly over the handle of the oven, folded the same way it always was. Nothing had been left undone, and there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the evening could now unfold at its own pace. The armchair creaked slightly as someone shifted their weight, not to get more comfortable so much as to settle more fully into the moment. The sound was small and familiar, part of the room's usual language. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second passing without ceremony. It had been marking time this way for years, and tonight was no different. On the television screen, Andy Taylor stood on a sidewalk in Mayberry, talking calmly, his voice even and reassuring. The words themselves were less important than the way they were spoken. There was no sharpness to them, no rush. They flowed easily, as if there were all the time in the world. The theme of the conversation hardly mattered. It was enough that it sounded the way it always had. The room seemed to listen in its own way. The curtains were drawn, keeping the outside darkness at bay, though a faint hint of the night still pressed against the windows. Somewhere outside, a car passed by, its tires humming briefly on the pavement before fading into the distance. The sound came and went without interrupting anything. In Mayberry, Opie crossed the screen, moving with the easy confidence of a child who knew his way around town. The scenes unfolded slowly, one leading into the next without effort. There were no sudden changes in volume, no jarring moments. Everything stayed within a narrow range, comfortable and predictable. The coffee table held a few familiar items. A folded newspaper rested at one corner, its headlines already read and set aside earlier in the evening. A pair of reading glasses lay next to it, folded carefully, waiting for another day. There was nothing else cluttering the surface. It had been left that way on purpose, though no one had thought much about it at the time. The television's glow reflected faintly in the glass of a framed photograph on the wall. The image inside was old, the edges slightly faded, but it had been hanging there for so long that it felt like part of the room itself. The light passed over it gently, changing with each shift of the scene. The sound of laughter came from the television, mild and unforced. It did not linger too long, and it did not rise too high. It simply appeared, did its work, and then settled back into the steady flow of voices and quiet moments. The laughter felt less like a cue and more like a natural response, something that belonged there. In the armchair, hands rested loosely in a lap, fingers relaxed. There was no need to hold anything or to reach for the remote. The channel had been chosen earlier, almost without thinking, and there was no reason to change it now. This was where the evening had landed, and it felt right to let it stay. The floor lamp hummed faintly, a sound barely noticeable unless the room grew very still. It had always done that, a small reminder that it was there, doing its job. The hum blended easily with the low murmur of the television, neither one overpowering the other. On the screen, Mayberry's streets appeared calm and familiar, the buildings standing quietly as the characters moved through them. There was a sense of space in those scenes, room to breathe, room to pause. Even when something needed to be said, it was said without pressure. The evening outside continued its slow progression. The sky had long since darkened, but the night was still young in its own way. Porch lights glowed up and down the street, each one marking a home settling in for the night. Somewhere nearby, a radio played faintly through an open window, though the sound was too distant to make out clearly. Back in the living room, The clock's second hand moved steadily, making its quiet circuit around the face. Time passed without drawing attention to itself. There was no sense of needing to check it, no reason to count the minutes. The evening was doing exactly what it was meant to do. On the television, Aunt Bee appeared, moving about the kitchen in Maybury, her presence calm and reassuring. The familiarity of her movements mirrored those that had taken place in the real kitchen earlier. There was something comforting in that echo, in the way small routines repeated themselves across spaces and years. The chair gave another soft creak as someone adjusted again, not out of restlessness but out of habit. The body found new ways to be still, settling deeper into the cushion. The fabric of the chair felt worn in the best way, shaped by years of quiet evenings much like this one. The volume of the television remained low, just enough to follow along if one wanted to, but gentle enough to fade into the background when attention drifted elsewhere. It had been set there deliberately, though the adjustment itself was no longer remembered. In Maybury, a scene unfolded slowly, the camera lingering longer than modern shows ever would. There was time to notice small things, the way characters stood, the way they listened. Silence was allowed to exist between lines, and it felt natural when it did. The living room seemed to respond in kind, holding on to its own quiet spaces. Nothing buzzed or chimed, nothing demanded to be checked or answered. The evening stretched out comfortably, like a familiar song played at just the right tempo. The faint scent of coffee still lingered in the air, though the cups had been emptied and rinsed some time ago. It mixed with the softer smells of the room, the fabric of the chair, the wood of the table, the clean calm of a space that had been lived in and cared for. On the television, Andy's voice carried again, steady and even. There was reassurance in its consistency, in knowing that it would not suddenly change. It was the same voice it had always been, doing what it had always done. The screen flickered almost imperceptibly as the scene shifted, a reminder of the television's age and the way it handled the picture. The flicker was not distracting, it was part of the experience, something that had always been there. Outside, the sound of the passing car had faded completely now, leaving behind a deeper quiet. The neighborhood had settled, each house enclosed in its own evening routines. Inside this living room, the routine was simple and familiar, and there was comfort in that simplicity. The armchair, the lamp, the television, the quiet room, and the steady presence of Maybury all remained just as they were, sharing the same unhurried moment as the evening continued to unfold without any need for it to be anything more than it already was. The television continued its steady glow, the picture holding firm without drawing the eye too sharply. The contrast of light and shadow on the screen shifted slightly as the scene changed, but the overall brightness of the room stayed the same. It was the kind of consistency that went unnoticed unless it was gone, the sort that allowed everything else to feel settled. The clock on the wall ticked on, the sound blending into the background so completely it was hard to say when it was last consciously heard. Its face reflected a faint glimmer from the lamp, and the hands moved with the same patient precision they always had. There was no sense of time pressing forward, only of it continuing. On the television, the voices carried on in their familiar cadence. Andy spoke again, then paused, letting the silence do some of the work. The pause lingered just long enough to feel natural. In the living room, that same pause seemed to stretch outward, filling the space between the furniture, resting gently on the rug and the low table. The armchair held its shape, the cushion slightly indented where it had been used so many times before. The fabric showed subtle wear along the arms, not frayed but softened, as though it had learned the shape of resting hands. There was comfort in that, in knowing exactly how it would feel to sit there without having to think about it. In the kitchen, the towel on the oven handle hung motionless. The light above the sink had been turned off earlier, leaving that part of the room dim but orderly. The counters were clear, the surfaces clean, and nothing waited to be done. It allowed the rest of the house to settle more deeply into the evening. On the screen, Maybury remained calm and familiar. The streets looked much the same from one moment to the next, and the buildings seemed content to stay exactly where they were. Characters moved through the scenes at an easy pace, stopping to talk, listening without hurry, continuing on when it felt right. The sound from the television stayed low and even. It did not rise unexpectedly or drop away entirely. It simply remained, a steady presence that filled the room without crowding it. If attention drifted toward it, there was something to hear. If attention drifted away, it did not follow. The reading glasses on the table caught a small glint of light as the scene on the television shifted again. The reflection passed over the lenses and then moved on, leaving them as they were. They had been set down earlier with care, folded neatly, ready to be picked up another time. Outside, the night continued quietly. A breeze moved somewhere beyond the walls, though it could not be felt inside. The house stood still, holding its warmth and its silence. Porch lights along the street burned steadily, each one marking a small island of light in the dark. The floor beneath the chair felt solid and unmoving. It had supported countless evenings like this one, bearing the weight of furniture, footsteps, and time itself without complaint. The rug lay flat and undisturbed, its pattern softened by years of use. On the television, Aunt Bee moved through another familiar space, her motions unhurried and practiced. The scene lingered long enough to feel complete without needing to move on quickly. It mirrored the pace of the evening itself, slow and deliberate in the most ordinary way. The lamp beside the chair continued to cast its warm circle of light. Dust motes drifted briefly through the beam and then disappeared again, visible only for a moment before settling back into the quiet. Nothing in the room felt sharp or defined. Edges softened as the evening wore on. The sound of the clock, the low voices from the television, and the faint hum of the lamp blended together into a single, steady presence. None of them stood out on their own. Together they made up the background of the night, as familiar as the walls themselves. The chair creaked once more as weight shifted slightly, a small adjustment that barely registered. The movement did not interrupt anything. It simply added another sound to the room's quiet vocabulary, one that had been spoken many times before. On the screen, Andy and Opie shared another moment, their voices calm, their movements unforced. The details of the exchange mattered less than the feeling it carried. It passed through the room gently, leaving no trace behind. The evening held steady, the living room unchanged, the television continuing its soft presence, as everything remained comfortably the same. The glow from the television held steady, its soft light brushing the walls and furniture without changing their shapes. The picture moved from one quiet scene to the next, but the room itself remained still, as though it had decided there was no reason to follow along too closely. The screen could flicker and shift, and the room would simply accept it. The clock's second hand passed the same numbers again and again, each small movement precise and unremarkable. It made its gentle sound without asking to be noticed. The ticking did not speed up or slow down. It stayed the same, dependable in a way that felt reassuring without calling attention to itself. On the television, voices came and went, sometimes overlapping slightly, sometimes leaving space between words. The space mattered as much as the sound. In those quiet moments, the room seemed to lean back, settling further into itself. The walls held the sound easily, letting it pass through without echo. The armchair remained angled just enough toward the television to suggest attention, though it asked for none. Its cushions held their shape, and the fabric showed a softness that only came from years of use. The arms of the chair were smooth where hands had rested countless times, each evening, leaving behind a familiarity that could be felt without thinking. The coffee table sat between the chair and the television, its surface clear except for the few items placed there earlier. The newspaper stayed folded, its pages untouched now. The reading glasses remained where they had been left, their position unchanged, as if they belonged there permanently. The lamp's shade diffused the light evenly, keeping it from becoming too bright. Its switch had been turned earlier with a simple motion, one that required no thought. Now it stayed on, doing its quiet work, filling the room with a warmth that felt steady and sufficient. In the kitchen, nothing stirred. The towel on the oven handle hung straight, its edge barely catching the ambient light from the living room. The counters remained clean and bare. The absence of movement there made the living room feel even more settled, as though the entire house had agreed to rest. On the screen, Mayberry's familiar places appeared again. The sidewalk, the storefronts, the calm expressions on faces that never seemed rushed. The scenes flowed together without urgency, each one taking its time. There was no sense of needing to reach a destination. Outside, the night stayed quiet. No new sounds pressed in through the walls. The earlier passing car felt like a distant memory now, its brief presence already absorbed into the larger calm of the evening. The street remained still, the houses quiet. The rug beneath the chair showed a subtle pattern that had faded gently over time. It lay flat and undisturbed, its edges curling nowhere, its surface worn smooth in places where feet had rested before finding a seat. It felt anchored, much like the rest of the room. The television's volume stayed where it was, low enough to soften the words but clear enough to recognize the voices. There was no need to reach for the knob or the remote. The balance had been found earlier and did not need adjusting. On the screen, a moment of mild humor passed, acknowledged by a gentle rise in sound and then a return to quiet. The laughter faded quickly, leaving behind the steady presence of voices and the faint sound of movement within the scene. Nothing lingered longer than it needed to. The air in the room felt still, carrying with it the faint mix of familiar scents, clean fabric, polished wood, the trace of coffee from earlier. None of it was strong enough to stand out. Together it formed the quiet background of the space. The chair gave a small sound again as weight shifted slightly, a movement more instinctive than intentional. The body adjusted, finding a comfortable stillness once more. The chair accepted it without protest, as it always did. On the television, Andy's voice returned, calm and even. It carried a tone that suggested patience rather than authority. The words moved through the room and settled without leaving any sharp edges behind. The framed photograph on the wall caught another faint reflection from the screen. The image within it stayed unchanged, watching the evening pass from its place on the wall. The reflection moved on, leaving the frame in shadow again. The clock continued its work, marking the quiet passage of time. The room did not respond to it. Nothing needed to be done because another minute had passed. The living room, the soft light, the steady television, and the calm presence of Mayberry remained as they were, holding the same gentle rhythm as the evening carried on. The picture on the television shifted again, not sharply, just enough to change the arrangement of light across the room. Shadows moved slightly along the wall behind the set, then settled back into their familiar shapes. The movement was subtle, easy to miss unless one happened to notice it, and even then, it did not seem important enough to follow. The lamp beside the chair continued to glow with the same steady warmth. Its light did not reach the far corners of the room, leaving them comfortably dim. Those darker spaces felt settled rather than empty, holding shelves, doorways, and quiet details that did not need to be seen clearly to be known. The clock's ticking remained even, each sound landing softly in the air before disappearing. The second hand passed the top of the clock face again, beginning another slow circle without any acknowledgement. The hour hand had barely moved at all, and there was no reason to check where it pointed. On the television, the scene lingered a little longer than expected. Characters stood without speaking for a moment, their expressions calm. That silence carried into the living room, where nothing filled it except the low hum of the set and the faint sound of the lamp. The pause felt natural, as though it belonged there. The armchair held steady, its legs firmly planted on the rug. The cushion no longer shifted, having found a shape that suited the moment. The fabric felt familiar against skin and clothing, neither too rough nor too smooth, just worn enough to feel known. The coffee table remained unchanged. The newspaper's edges lay flat, no pages curling up. The reading glasses stayed folded, their temples aligned neatly. They reflected a small glimmer of light now and then as the television image moved, but otherwise they remained still. In the kitchen, the darkness stayed complete but comfortable. The outline of cabinets and appliances could be made out faintly, but there was no reason to look closely. Everything there had been taken care of earlier, and it showed in the way the space rested. On the screen, Mayberry's quiet rhythm continued. The familiar storefronts appeared again, then the inside of another room, each place shown without hurry. The camera seemed content to stay where it was, letting the scene unfold at its own pace. The sound from the television stayed consistent. Voices rose and fell gently, never straying far from the same calm range. There were no sharp noises, no sudden changes. It all blended easily into the room's quiet. Outside, the night air pressed lightly against the windows. Curtains hung still, their fabric catching just enough light to show their folds. No breeze disturbed them, and no sound slipped through from the street. The rug's surface showed slight variations in colour where years of footsteps had passed. Those worn paths told their own quiet story, one that did not need retelling. The rug stayed flat and dependable beneath the chair. The lamp's shade softened the bulb's light evenly, its edge forming a gentle boundary between brightness and shadow. The cord ran neatly down the side of the table, out of sight. Nothing about it demanded attention. On the television, Andy spoke again, his voice calm and measured. The words were clear but unremarkable, the kind that did not need to be remembered later. They filled the room briefly and then moved on. The framed photograph on the wall remained where it had always been. The glass caught a faint reflection from the television once more, then returned to its quiet stillness. The image inside did not change, no matter how the light shifted around it. The clock continued its steady marking of time. Another minute passed, then another, each one leaving the room exactly as it had found it. Nothing in the space reacted to their passing. The chair creaked softly as weight shifted just a little, then settled again. The sound faded quickly, absorbed into the room's familiar collection of quiet noises. The television's glow, the soft lamplight, the steady ticking of the clock, and the calm presence of Mayberry all remained in place as the evening continued, with the room holding its shape and its stillness as the screen quietly carried on. The television remained where it was, its soft glow steady and unchanging, illuminating the front of the set and the wall behind it with the same muted light. The picture shifted gently as another scene took its place, but the overall feel of the room did not follow those changes closely. It stayed settled, as if anchored by habit, rather than by whatever happened to be on the screen. The clock's ticking carried on, one small sound at a time, landing in the quiet without effort. Each tick sounded much like the last, and together they formed a rhythm that blended into the evening. It was easy to forget the clock entirely, even though it never stopped making itself known. The armchair sat comfortably within its familiar patch of light. The cushion no longer moved, having settled into a shape that felt right. The arms of the chair bore the faint smoothness that comes from years of resting hands, from evenings spent sitting much like this one, with little reason to move. On the coffee table, nothing had shifted. The newspaper remained folded neatly, its creases holding firm. The reading glasses stayed beside it, the frames resting lightly on the wood. They had been placed there earlier with no particular thought, yet they seemed exactly where they belonged. The lamp continued to glow, its light warm and even. It did not flicker or buzz noticeably, just hummed faintly if the room grew quiet enough to notice. The shade diffused the light in a way that softened everything it touched, leaving no harsh lines behind. In the kitchen, the darkness stayed calm and orderly. The outline of the counter could be seen faintly, and the sink reflected just a trace of light from the living room. The towel on the oven handle hung straight, its edge unmoving, as if it had always been there. On the television, Mayberry appeared again, the same streets and rooms returning without ceremony. Characters moved at a measured pace, stopping to speak, listening patiently. The scenes felt familiar even when they changed, carrying the same unhurried tone from one moment to the next. The volume of the television stayed low, steady enough that it never startled the room. Voices drifted in and out of focus, depending on where attention happened to land. They were present without insisting on being followed. Outside, the night remained still. No new sounds reached the windows. The porch lights along the street continued to glow. Steady points of light marking homes that had settled into their own quiet routines. The rug beneath the chair showed its familiar pattern, softened by time and use. It lay flat against the floor, offering a gentle surface beneath the furniture. It had been there for years, and tonight was no different from many others it had known. The television's picture shifted again, the contrast changing just enough to move the shadows along the wall. The movement was slow and subtle, and it passed without drawing attention. The room accepted it easily and returned to stillness. On the screen, a brief exchange unfolded, the voices calm and evenly paced. The moment passed without emphasis, blending seamlessly into what followed. Nothing in the scene lingered longer than it needed to. The clock continued its steady work. The second hand reached the top of the face again and moved on, beginning another slow circuit. The hour hand stayed nearly where it was, giving no sense of urgency. The chair made a small sound as weight shifted slightly, a familiar creak that faded almost as soon as it appeared. The movement was instinctive, a quiet adjustment that did not interrupt anything else in the room. The framed photograph on the wall caught another faint reflection from the television, then slipped back into shadow. The image inside remained unchanged, watching the evening pass from its place on the wall. The air in the living room stayed still, carrying with it the faint mix of everyday scents. Nothing about it felt sharp or new. It was the air of a space that had been lived in and cared for, comfortable in its familiarity. The television continued to play, the lamp continued to glow, the clock continued to tick, and the living room remained quietly at ease, holding the same calm moment as the evening moved forward without asking anything of it. The television stayed quietly at work, its picture steady and its sound calm, offering no surprises. The glow from the screen rested against the wall and the edges of the furniture, familiar enough that it no longer felt like light so much as part of the room itself. The image shifted again as another scene appeared, but the change was gentle, almost unremarkable. The clock's ticking continued at the same measured pace. Each sound landed softly and then disappeared, leaving the room exactly as it had been before. The passing of seconds did not alter anything. It simply marked time moving along without calling attention to it. The armchair remained still, its cushion holding its shape. The fabric looked slightly darker where it had been worn smooth, the result of countless evenings spent in the same position. It was the kind of wear that made the chair more comfortable rather than less, a sign that it had been used as it was meant to be. On the coffee table, the newspaper had not shifted. Its pages lay flat, the crease along the fold clear and straight. The reading glasses remained beside it, their frames catching the light now and then as the television picture changed. They stayed where they were, waiting without any urgency. The lamp beside the chair continued to cast its warm circle of light. The shade softened the glow so that it reached the room gently, without harshness. The table beneath it held steady, its surface clean and uncluttered, offering nothing that needed attention. In the kitchen, the quiet stayed complete. The sink reflected a faint shimmer of light from the living room, but nothing else moved. The towel on the oven handle hung just as it had earlier, straight and undisturbed. On the television, Mayberry's familiar calm carried on. The scene unfolded slowly, allowing time for small details to exist without being pointed out. A door opened, then closed. Someone paused before speaking. The moment passed without being marked as important. The volume of the television remained unchanged. It was low enough to be gentle, high enough to be reassuring. The voices felt present but distant, like a conversation carried on in the next room. Outside, the night remained still. The windows held their dark reflections, and the curtains stayed drawn. No new sounds pressed in from beyond the walls. The neighborhood seemed settled into its own quiet agreement with the evening. The rug beneath the chair lay flat and dependable. Its pattern had faded in places where feet had crossed it over the years, but it still held its shape. It felt like part of the room's foundation, steady and familiar. The television's picture shifted again, the contrast changing slightly as another scene took its place. Shadows moved gently across the wall and then stopped. The room accepted the change without reacting. On the screen, Andy's voice returned, even and calm. The words moved through the air without urgency, filling the space briefly before giving way to another pause. That pause lingered comfortably, allowing the room to remain quiet. The framed photograph on the wall caught another faint reflection from the screen. The light passed over the glass and then moved on, leaving the image behind it unchanged. The photograph stayed where it had always been, part of the room's steady backdrop. The clock continued to mark time, its second hand making another slow trip around the face. The sound of it blended into the room so completely it was easy to forget it was there. The chair made a small sound as weight shifted slightly, a familiar creak that faded quickly. The movement was minor, more a settling than a change, and the chair returned to stillness almost immediately. The air in the living room remained calm, holding the faint, familiar sense of fabric and wood. Nothing about it felt new or sharp. It was the air of a space at ease with itself. The television went on playing, the lamp continued to glow, the clock kept ticking, and the living room stayed quietly unchanged as the evening held its steady course. The television's glow continued to rest gently across the room, touching the edges of the furniture without changing their outlines. The picture moved on to another familiar view of Mayberry, but the transition was so smooth it barely registered. The room did not react. It had already settled into a rhythm that did not depend on what came next. The clock kept its quiet pace. The ticking was steady and even, a small sound that had long since blended into the background. It did not interrupt the voices from the television or the soft hum of the lamp. It simply existed alongside them, marking time without asking anyone to notice. The armchair remained angled toward the screen, though nothing about the posture suggested close attention. The cushion held firm, shaped by years of use into something that felt reliable. The fabric showed its age in a gentle way, softened rather than worn thin, carrying the memory of countless evenings spent much like this one. The coffee table sat undisturbed. The newspaper stayed folded, its pages unmoving. The reading glasses remained exactly where they had been left, their frames catching a faint glimmer of light whenever the screen brightened for a moment. The table itself bore a few subtle marks, small signs of use that had accumulated over time and then become part of its character. The lamp continued to cast its warm circle of light. The shade muted the brightness so that it never felt harsh. The light settled across the rug and the lower part of the wall, leaving the corners of the room in comfortable shadow. Those darker spaces felt calm and complete, not empty, as though they were simply resting. In the kitchen, the stillness remained unchanged. The counters stayed clear, the sink clean, the towel on the oven handle hanging straight. Nothing called for attention there. The room beyond the living room felt finished for the night, its work already done. On the television, the pace stayed unhurried. Characters spoke, then paused, allowing the quiet to linger between words. The pauses felt natural, as though there was no reason to rush them. In the living room, those moments of quiet settled easily, blending with the low sounds already present. Outside, the night held steady. The windows reflected the soft interior light, turning the darkness beyond into a faint mirror. No movement showed itself there. The street remained quiet, the houses along it resting behind drawn curtains and steady porch lights. The rug beneath the chair showed its familiar pattern, softened by time. The fibres lay flat, worn gently where feet had passed over them again and again. It felt anchored, much like the rest of the room, content to remain exactly where it was. The television picture shifted slightly, adjusting contrast and shadow as the scene changed. The movement of light along the wall was subtle, slow enough that it barely registered. The room absorbed the change without responding, returning immediately to its settled stillness. Andy's voice carried through the speaker again, even and calm. The words themselves were unremarkable, the kind that did not need remembering. They moved through the room and then passed on, leaving behind the same quiet atmosphere they had entered. The framed photograph on the wall caught another faint reflection from the screen. The light traced the glass briefly, then moved away. The image behind the glass stayed constant, unaffected by the passing glow. The clock's second hand completed another full circle. The sound of its movement remained unchanged, steady and familiar. Time passed without altering anything in the room, without signalling that something should happen next. The armchair gave a soft creak as weight shifted slightly. The movement was small and instinctive, a quiet adjustment that brought the body back into a comfortable stillness. The chair accepted it easily and returned to silence. The air in the room felt settled, carrying faint, familiar scents that blended together without standing out. Fabric, wood, and the lingering trace of earlier coffee formed a background presence as steady as the light and sound. The television continued on at its gentle pace, The lamp remained warm and steady, the clock kept ticking, and the living room held its calm, unchanged presence as the same quiet evening continued to unfold. The television remained the quiet center of the room, not because it demanded attention, but because its presence had become part of the room's balance. The screen's light fell evenly across the floor and the lower shelves, touching the spines of a few books that had not been opened in some time. Their titles were indistinct in the dimness, but their familiar shapes added to the sense that everything in the room was where it belonged. The clock kept marking the seconds in its patient way. Each tick arrived softly and left just as quietly, never piling up or calling for notice. The sound was so consistent that it felt less like noise and more like a texture in the air, something that filled the space without changing it. The armchair remained still, its cushion holding firm. The fabric along the seat and arms showed subtle variations in colour where it had been touched most often, a quiet record of long evenings spent sitting without much movement. The chair did not look new, and it did not need to. Its comfort came from familiarity rather than freshness. On the coffee table, the newspaper's edges stayed aligned. The fold held its crease, and the paper lay flat, as though it had settled into its position and decided not to move again. The reading glasses rested beside it, their lenses catching a faint glow now and then as the screen brightened or dimmed. They reflected the room back to itself in miniature, small curved glimpses of light and shadow. The lamp's warmth continued to soften the space. Its light fell gently on the rug, highlighting the texture of the fibres and the way they lay slightly flatter in places where feet had crossed earlier in the evening. The lamp did not hum loudly, but if the room grew quiet enough, its presence could be felt in a faint, steady way. The kitchen beyond remained unchanged. The darkness there felt complete and orderly, the outlines of cabinets and appliances resting quietly in the background. The towel on the oven handle still hung straight, its fabric undisturbed. Nothing waited to be done, and that absence of obligation seemed to spread through the rest of the house. On the television, Maybury returned to a familiar corner of town. The scene unfolded at a pace that felt unhurried and patient, allowing time for small gestures and quiet expressions. Characters moved through their lines without emphasis, speaking as though there were no need to rush to the next moment. The sound from the television stayed even. Voices rose slightly and then settled again, never straying far from the same gentle range. There were pauses where nothing was said, and those pauses felt comfortable rather than empty. They allowed the room to remain just as quiet as it wanted to be. Outside, the night pressed lightly against the windows. The curtains hung still, their folds catching a trace of the lamp's light. The glass reflected the interior softly, turning the living room into a faint double image layered over the darkness beyond. The rug beneath the chair held steady. Its pattern was muted now, softened by years of use, but it still offered a sense of structure beneath the furniture. It anchored the space in a way that felt reassuring, as though the room itself rested on something dependable. The television picture shifted again, the contrast adjusting gently as the scene changed. Shadows moved across the wall behind the set, then settled back into their familiar shapes. The movement passed without drawing attention, absorbed easily by the stillness of the room. Andy's voice carried through the speaker once more, calm and measured. The words were clear but unremarkable, the kind that did not ask to be remembered. They passed through the air and then gave way to another moment of quiet. The framed photograph on the wall caught a soft reflection from the screen again. The light traced the edge of the frame briefly, then slipped away. The image inside remained unchanged, its presence steady and unobtrusive. The clock's second hand completed another slow circle. The sound of its ticking remained constant, blending into the background so thoroughly that it felt inseparable from the room itself. Time moved forward without leaving any visible mark. The armchair made a small sound as weight shifted slightly. The creak was familiar and brief, fading almost as soon as it appeared. The chair settled back into stillness, holding its shape and its place without complaint. The air in the living room felt settled and familiar. It carried the faint scent of clean fabric, polished wood, and the lingering trace of earlier coffee. None of it stood out on its own. Together it formed a quiet background that matched the light and sound. The television continued on. The lamp remained steady, the clock kept ticking, and the living room stayed quietly at ease, holding the same unhurried moment as the evening moved along in its own familiar way. The television continued to glow with the same quiet steadiness, its light spreading gently across the living room without changing the feel of the space. The screen shifted from one familiar scene to another, but the changes were subtle enough that they felt more like a continuation than a transition. The room did not respond to those changes. It remained settled, as though it had already decided how the evening would unfold and saw no reason to reconsider. The clock on the wall kept ticking, each sound landing softly and then dissolving into the background. The rhythm of it had long since blended with the low hum of the lamp and the muted voices from the television. Together, they formed a steady backdrop that did not rise or fall. It stayed even, predictable, and quietly reassuring. The armchair beneath the lamp held its shape, the cushion firm but yielding in the way that only came from long familiarity. The fabric along the seat and arms showed the gentle polish of use, darker in places where hands and elbows had rested over the years. The chair did not creak now. It seemed content to remain exactly as it was, holding still without effort. The coffee table sat between the chair and the television, its surface unchanged. The folded newspaper lay where it had been left, corners aligned, pages unmoving. The reading glasses rested beside it, lenses turned slightly upward, catching faint reflections as the screen brightened and dimmed. The reflections appeared briefly and then vanished, leaving the glasses exactly as they were. The lamp's light continued to soften the room. Its shade diffused the glow evenly, keeping the brightness gentle and contained. The light reached across the rug, tracing the flattened fibres where feet had crossed earlier in the evening. The rug absorbed the light quietly, offering no shine, only texture. Beyond the living room, the kitchen remained still and dark. The counters were clear, the sink clean, the towel on the oven handle hanging straight. Nothing there suggested movement or unfinished work. The kitchen felt settled in the same way the living room did, as though the entire house had agreed to pause for the night. On the television, Mayberry's calm rhythm continued. A familiar street appeared, then the inside of a room, each place shown without hurry. Characters spoke in measured tones, their words spaced comfortably apart. There were moments when no one spoke at all, and those moments felt just as complete as the ones filled with conversation. The volume of the television stayed low and consistent. Voices drifted easily through the room, present but not insistent. It was possible to follow along if attention settled there, but it was just as easy to let the sound wash over everything else without focusing on any single word. Outside, the night remained quiet. The windows reflected the living room softly, turning the lamp and television glow into faint shapes against the dark glass. Curtains hung motionless, their folds catching just enough light to show their shape. No breeze stirred them. The street beyond remained unseen and unheard. The rug beneath the chair felt steady and grounded. Its pattern, once sharper, had softened over time, but it still provided a sense of order beneath the furniture. It lay flat, edges smooth, holding its place without shifting. The television picture adjusted slightly as the scene changed, shadows moving gently along the wall behind the set. The movement was slow and unremarkable, passing without drawing attention. The room accepted the change and returned immediately to stillness. Andy's voice came through the speaker again, even and calm. The words carried no urgency, no emphasis that lingered. They filled the room briefly and then gave way to another pause. That pause settled comfortably, blending with the ticking clock and the faint hum of the lamp. The framed photograph on the wall caught a soft reflection from the screen. The light traced the glass for a moment, then slipped away. The image behind the glass remained unchanged, its presence steady and quiet, watching the evening pass without comment. The clock's second hand completed another slow circuit. The ticking remained consistent, neither louder nor softer than before. Time moved forward without leaving any visible mark on the room. The armchair made a faint sound as weight shifted slightly, a small adjustment that came and went without interrupting anything else. The chair settled again, returning to stillness almost immediately, as though it had simply acknowledged the movement and then let it pass. The air in the living room felt calm and familiar. It carried the faint scent of clean fabric, polished wood, and the lingering trace of coffee from earlier. None of those scents stood out on their own. Together they formed a background presence as steady as the light and sound. The television continued to play, scenes unfolding one after another at the same unhurried pace. The glow from the screen remained even, never bright enough to dominate the room, never dim enough to disappear. It stayed balanced, fitting neatly into the space it occupied. The lamp remained unchanged, its light steady and warm. Dust motes drifted briefly through the beam and then vanished again, visible only for an instant before settling back into the quiet. The lamp did not follow them. It simply continued to glow. The coffee table showed faint marks from years of use, small scratches and softened edges that had long since become part of its character. The newspaper and glasses did not move. They seemed content to remain exactly where they were, waiting without urgency. In the kitchen, the darkness stayed complete. The towel on the oven handle still hung straight, its edge unmoving. The sink reflected a faint shimmer of light from the living room, but nothing else stirred. On the television, Mayberry returned to another familiar spot. The same calm expressions, the same easy movements. Characters listened as much as they spoke. The camera lingered, allowing time for small gestures and quiet moments to exist without being rushed. The sound from the television blended seamlessly with the room's other quiet noises. The ticking clock, the lamp's faint hum and the low voices formed a steady, unchanging backdrop. None of the sounds competed. Each one occupied its own space. Outside, the night remained still. Porch lights along the street continued to glow steadily, marking homes settled into their own routines. No new sounds reached the windows. The darkness beyond felt complete but gentle. The rug, the chair, the table, the lamp, and the television all remained where they were. Nothing shifted. Nothing suggested the need for movement. The room felt balanced, as though everything had found its place long ago and saw no reason to change it now. The clock ticked on. The television played quietly, the lamp continued to glow, and the living room stayed calm and unchanged, holding the same gentle moment as the evening continued at its familiar, unhurried pace. The television continued to occupy its quiet place in the room, not as a point of focus so much as a steady presence that everything else seemed to arrange itself around. The light from the screen stayed soft and even, resting against the wall and the edges of the furniture with a familiarity that made it feel permanent. The image changed again, another scene from Mayberry easing into view, but the transition was so gentle that it barely registered as a change at all. The clock on the wall kept its slow, patient rhythm. Each tick sounded the same as the one before it, neither louder nor softer, never hurrying. The sound did not echo or linger. It simply appeared and then dissolved back into the room, leaving the space exactly as it had been. The hands moved forward without drawing attention to themselves, and there was no impulse to look up and check the time. The armchair remained beneath the lamp, angled just enough toward the television to suggest interest without commitment. The cushion held steady, shaped by countless evenings spent sitting in much the same way. The fabric along the seat and arms showed a subtle sheen where it had been smoothed by years of use, the result of hands resting, shifting, and then settling again. The chair felt known, predictable in the best sense of the word. The coffee table sat quietly between the chair and the television. Its surface remained unchanged, the folded newspaper still aligned neatly, the reading glasses resting beside it exactly where they had been placed. The lenses caught a faint glimmer now and then as the picture on the screen brightened or darkened, but the reflections were brief and easily missed. Nothing on the table suggested urgency or unfinished business. The lamp continued to glow with the same warm steadiness. The shade softened the light so that it spread evenly across the room, leaving no sharp edges or harsh contrasts. The light touched the rug, bringing out the gentle variations in texture where the fibres lay flatter from years of footsteps. The lamp did not flicker or buzz. It simply stayed on, doing what it had always done. Beyond the living room, the kitchen remained quiet and dark. The counters stayed clear, the sink clean, the towel on the oven handle hanging straight and undisturbed. The outlines of cabinets and appliances could be made out faintly, but there was no reason to look closely. Everything there had been taken care of earlier, and the room seemed content to remain at rest. On the television, Mayberry's calm rhythm continued without interruption. The familiar streets appeared again, then the interior of a room, each scene unfolding at an unhurried pace. Characters spoke in measured tones, their words spaced comfortably apart. There were pauses where nothing was said at all, and those pauses felt complete in themselves, as though they were meant to be there. The sound from the television stayed low and consistent. Voices drifted through the room without demanding attention. They were present enough to be reassuring, distant enough to fade into the background when focus wandered elsewhere. It was possible to listen closely or not listen at all, and either way, the room remained unchanged. Outside, the night held steady. The windows reflected the living room softly, turning the lamp's glow and the television's light into faint shapes layered over the dark glass. Curtains hung motionless, their folds catching just enough light to show their shape. No breeze stirred them, and no sound from the street pressed in. The rug beneath the chair felt grounded and dependable. Its pattern, once more distinct, had softened over time, but it still provided a sense of order beneath the furniture. The rug lay flat, edges smooth, offering quiet support without shifting or curling. The television picture adjusted slightly as another scene appeared, shadows moving gently along the wall behind the set. The movement was slow and subtle, passing without drawing attention. The room absorbed the change easily, returning to its settled stillness almost immediately. Andy's voice came through the speaker again, even and calm. The words carried no urgency, no emphasis that lingered. They filled the room briefly and then gave way to another quiet moment. That quiet blended seamlessly with the ticking clock and the faint hum of the lamp. The framed photograph on the wall caught a soft reflection from the screen. The light traced the glass for a moment, then slipped away, leaving the image behind it unchanged. The photograph remained where it had always been, a steady part of the room's background. The clock's second hand completed another slow circuit. The ticking remained consistent, marking time without altering anything. Minutes passed, but the room did not respond. Nothing shifted or changed because another minute had gone by. The armchair gave a faint creak as weight shifted slightly. The movement was instinctive, a small adjustment that came and went without interrupting the room's calm. The chair settled again, holding its shape and its place without complaint. The air in the living room felt settled and familiar. It carried the faint scent of clean fabric, polished wood, and the lingering trace of coffee from earlier in the evening. None of those scents stood out on their own. Together, they formed a quiet background presence that matched the room's steady light and sound. The television continued to play, scenes unfolding one after another at the same unhurried pace. The glow from the screen remained even, never bright enough to dominate the room, never dim enough to disappear. It stayed balanced, fitting neatly into the space it occupied. The lamp remained unchanged, its light steady and warm. Dust motes drifted briefly through the beam and then vanished again, visible only for an instant before settling back into the quiet. The lamp did not follow them. It simply continued to glow. The coffee table showed faint marks from years of use, small scratches and softened edges that had long since become part of its character. The newspaper and glasses did not move. They seemed content to remain exactly where they were, waiting without urgency. In the kitchen, the darkness stayed complete. The towel on the oven handle still hung straight, its edge unmoving. The sink reflected a faint shimmer of light from the living room, but nothing else stirred. The room beyond remained as quiet as it had been earlier. On the television, Mayberry returned to another familiar spot. The same calm expressions, the same easy movements. Characters listened as much as they spoke, allowing silence to do some of the work. The camera lingered, giving the moment time to settle before moving on. The sound from the television blended seamlessly with the room's other quiet noises. The ticking clock, the lamp's faint hum, and the low voices formed a steady backdrop that did not shift or compete. Each sound occupied its own space, contributing to the room's overall calm. Outside, the night remained still. Porch lights along the street continued to glow steadily, marking homes settled into their own routines. The darkness beyond the windows felt complete but gentle, pressing lightly against the glass without intrusion. The rug, the chair, the table, the lamp, and the television all remained where they were. Nothing suggested the need for movement. The room felt balanced, as though everything had found its place long ago and saw no reason to change it now. The television's picture shifted again, the contrast changing slightly as the scene moved on. Shadows slid along the wall and then settled back into their familiar positions. The movement passed without leaving a trace. The clock ticked on, its sound steady and unchanging. Another minute passed, then another, each one leaving the room exactly as it had been before. There was no sense of build-up or release, only continuation. The armchair remained still, its cushion holding firm. The fabric showed its familiar wear, softened by time rather than thinned by it. The chair did not ask for adjustment, it simply stayed as it was. The lamp's light continued to soften the room. The shade kept the brightness contained, allowing the corners to remain dim. Those darker spaces felt settled, holding shelves, doorways, and familiar outlines that did not need to be seen clearly. The television carried on quietly, the voices steady and calm, and the living room remained at ease, holding the same gentle moment as the evening continued in its familiar, unhurried way. The television stayed exactly where it had been all evening, its soft light continuing to settle into the room as if it had always belonged there. The screen shifted once more, the familiar shapes and tones of Mayberry easing into another quiet arrangement. The change was gradual, so smooth that it felt less like a new scene and more like the same moment, turning slightly to show another side. The clock maintained its gentle ticking, each sound arriving with the same weight and then fading away. It never called attention to itself, yet it was always present, marking the slow passage of time in a way that felt almost ceremonial. The hands moved forward with patience, never rushing, never pausing, and there was no impulse to look up and take note of where they were. The armchair remained steady beneath the lamp, its position unchanged. The cushion held its shape, neither sinking further nor shifting back. The fabric along the arms and seat showed the familiar smoothness of use, the kind that came from years of quiet evenings and small adjustments. The chair felt settled, as though it had long ago learned how to be comfortable without needing to be rearranged. The coffee table remained undisturbed. The newspaper lay folded, the crease firm, the pages resting flat. The reading glasses stayed beside it. Lenses turned slightly toward the ceiling, reflecting faint traces of light that appeared and disappeared with the movement of the screen. They did not slide or shift. They waited without expectation. The lamp's glow continued to soften the room. Its shade diffused the light evenly, allowing it to spread gently across the rug and the lower walls. The light never reached too far, leaving the corners of the room dim but familiar. Those shadows felt settled, holding the outlines of shelves and doorways without asking to be examined. The kitchen beyond the living room remained quiet and unchanged. The darkness there felt orderly, as though everything had been put in its place earlier and left to rest. The towel on the oven handle still hung straight, its fabric unmoving. The sink reflected a faint glimmer of light, but nothing else stirred. On the television, Mayberry's easy pace continued. The camera lingered, allowing the scene to unfold without hurry. Characters spoke calmly, listening as much as they talked. There were moments when nothing happened at all, and those moments felt complete, as though they needed no further action to justify their presence. The sound from the television stayed low and even. Voices drifted through the room in a way that felt companionable rather than commanding. They could be followed if attention settled there, or they could fade into the background without leaving any sense of something missed. Outside, the night remained still. The windows reflected the interior softly, layering the lamp's glow and the television's light over the darkness beyond. Curtains hung motionless, their folds unchanged. No breeze moved them, and no distant sounds reached the room. The rug beneath the chair felt steady and familiar. Its pattern had softened over time, but it still offered a quiet sense of structure beneath the furniture. The fibres lay flat, worn smooth in places where feet had passed earlier in the evening, holding the room together in a way that felt dependable. The television picture adjusted slightly as the scene changed again. Shadows moved gently along the wall behind the set, then settled back into shapes that felt known. The movement was subtle and passed quickly, leaving the room just as it had been. Andy's voice returned, even and calm, carrying words that did not linger. The tone remained steady, unhurried and familiar. The words filled the space briefly and then gave way to silence, which settled comfortably alongside the ticking clock. The framed photograph on the wall caught another faint reflection from the screen. The light traced the glass for a moment, then slipped away, leaving the image behind it unchanged. The photograph remained a quiet witness to the evening, its presence steady and unobtrusive. The clock's second hand completed another slow circle. The ticking remained constant, blending into the background so completely that it was easy to forget it was there. Time moved forward without altering the room's calm. The armchair gave a soft creak as weight shifted slightly, a small, instinctive adjustment. The sound appeared and faded quickly, absorbed into the room's familiar collection of quiet noises. The chair settled again, holding its shape without complaint. The air in the living room remained calm and familiar. It carried the faint scent of fabric, wood, and the lingering trace of coffee from earlier. None of it stood out. Together, the scents formed a quiet backdrop that matched the light and sound. The television continued to play at its gentle pace. The lamp remained warm and steady. The clock kept ticking. The living room stayed at ease, holding the same unhurried moment as the evening went on, unchanged and unremarkable in the most comfortable way.